Ambassador Aharoni.
Thank you for this nice introduction, which is quite old. My oldest is already 23. But thank you so much. This is a real honor for me, especially the fact that I was invited to share the panel with such an esteemed and legendary diplomat, former ambassador to Israel, Dan Kurtzer. One of the most inspiring moments in my career was when I was driving one day into the city. This is 2002, maybe 2003. On the radio, there was a radio show here on WABC called Curtis and Kubi in the morning. And they had an item on an incident that took place in Israel the day before, in which one of the members of the Knesset insulted Ambassador Kurtzer in a very big way. And it was a very unfortunate incident. But what was unique and inspiring and uplifting about this whole thing is that in the middle of their conversation, Curtis and Kubi, about what happened in the Israeli Knesset, they said, "Oh, we have an interesting call coming in. It's Ambassador Kurtz's sister calling from New Jersey." And she called to defend her brother. And this was a very, very special moment, and I'll never forget that. And I remember getting into my office that morning, and I wrote a cable to Jerusalem about what happened with the ambassador's sister on the radio. And so I'll never forget that. Also, I have to, Alan, you mentioned the fact that I was involved in the team that negotiated, and I had a very, very small part serving as Uri Savir's right-hand person at the time, but the person in the audience who's really played a major part in those negotiations is sitting right there, and that's Professor Jacob Frenkel, whom I met for the first time then in 1993 when he served as the governor of Israel's central bank and also led the economic negotiations with the Palestinians. And today he's obviously the chairperson of J.P. Morgan Chase, and we'll hear from him later on. Also here I have to acknowledge the presence of my dear friend, Lieutenant General Jerry Gershon, who was the head... What? Major General. Let me put it this way, the ultimate soldier, Jerry Gershon. A dear friend of mine, those of you who don't know, before he became the head of American Friends of the IDF, he headed the Israeli Home Front Command and did it exceedingly well and successfully, and people still remember you with admiration in Israel. So thank you, Jerry. I was asked to say a few words about the situation. The ambassador already outlined the specific and unique implications of what we're now seeing as the rise of political Islam, and I agree with you that we should not refer to it as the Arab Spring for many reasons, but what it really is probably the undoing, if you may, of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. This is not going to end tomorrow. This is a very, very complicated, unfortunately will not be violent, but more likely to be violent process that will last maybe even a generation. That's my belief. This is the way we look at it. We don't know how this process will end, and we don't know what it means in terms of Israel's military and what it means in terms of the policy. But what we can do, and what I'd like to do in the next couple of minutes, is to share with you the things that we've learned thus far. And I'd like to begin with your permission, since the Ambassador mentioned the lack of political progress between Israelis and Palestinians. I'd like to spend a couple of minutes talking about the way we see things, not necessarily from the point of view of the Israeli government, but more from the point of view of the Israeli society. Because we talk a lot about the will of politicians, and we tend to forget sometimes that Israel is a democracy. It may be a hyperactive democracy, it can be an overly energetic, dynamic democracy. Some people say disturbed democracy, but at the end of the day, our democracy can be awkward, but the will of the public find its way to be expressed. It is being expressed almost every day also in policy making. What happened sociologically in Israel that affects directly the prospects of peace between Israelis and Palestinians. I'll tell you what I think. Something very dramatic happened 12 years ago that still impacts public discourse in Israel. We went to Camp David under the auspices of the US administration. President Clinton put forth a far-reaching compromise that would have given the Palestinians the overwhelming majority of their territorial demands. The Palestinians said no. Israel said yes. But the Palestinians, not only that they said no, they waged war against Israel. Not necessarily against Israeli soldiers. They waged war against Israeli civilians. It was a strategic decision. Obviously, Israel's reaction to that, I don't have to tell you, started with a targeted campaign to eliminate the heads of the terrorist organizations, continued with the erection of the fence, and ended with the second dramatic event in that string of events that I'd like to describe to you here today, with the embrace of unilateralism as our policy vis-à-vis the Palestinians by Prime Minister Ariel Sharon in 2005. Ariel Sharon, the most unlikely person to do so, decided to uproot Israeli communities, some of them were thriving communities from Gaza, and to get out of Gaza. He fulfilled, if you may, the Palestinian dream. People tend to forget that in addition to all the communities that were destroyed in Gaza, 5 more communities in the Jenin area were also uprooted. What did the Palestinians do with that golden opportunity to turn Gaza into an oasis? They used Gaza as a launching pad to attack Israel time and again. And then the ambassador mentioned the third incident that happened in 2008. According to Condoleezza Rice's book, her memoirs, she was stunned by Ehud Olmert's proposal that was yet again declined by Abu Mazen. So you take all 3 events, major dramatic events that happened in the last 12 years, from the decline of the Camp David II attempt, the accord, the summit, through the aftermath of the disengagement from Gaza, all the way to the failure of the Olmert-Abu Mazen talks. And here you have a new Israeli mindset that was formed throughout that decade that says the following: if up until Camp David we thought that the unfinished business between Israelis and Palestinians was the 1967 Six-Day War, which was about land, meaning it gave rise to the whole notion of territorial compromise. We will give them territory, we will get in return peace and security. Then after those string of events that proved to the Israelis that maybe this is not about territory, maybe it's about something else, more and more Israelis became convinced that the unfinished business is not 67, but rather 48. And 48 was over our very right to exist. And if you're looking for an answer to the question why Israel is insisting on recognition, not only in our right to exist in peace and security, but also recognition in Israel as the national homeland of the Jewish people, here's the answer. So sociologically, psychologically, you're looking at the majority of Israelis today that may support the two-state solution. By the way, the Israeli government is committed to the two-state solution, but at the same time will tell you, we don't believe it's about territory. Every study conducted on this issue points to that very fact. Israelis don't believe the conflict is about land. They used to. And you're looking at the divisions within the Israeli political system, at the makeup of the Israeli Knesset, and what I just told you is being reflected in the structure of the Knesset today. Simple. And people have to understand that. Israeli democracy may be awkward, but at the end, it reflects the will of the people. Now, the Arab Spring. the so-called Arab Spring. We see a great deal of opportunity there, as well as a number of major risks. Where's the opportunity? And again, it affects directly the upcoming national elections in Israel, and I'll explain how in a second. For the first time in many, many years, maybe since 9/11, one of our biggest problems in foreign policy, especially when it comes to the Middle East, not so much in the United States, but mostly in Europe, is the so-called linkage argument. What is the linkage argument? The linkage argument, by the way, has many fans in American academia. The linkage argument very simply says the following. The root cause for all instability in the Middle East is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If you would like to bring about a resolution to all the problems in the Middle East, the first thing you have to do is resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That will bring stability. That is really the meaning of the linkage argument. Who used the linkage argument? Mostly Arab leaders. Why? Your guess is as good as mine, but probably in order to divert attention from their own wrongdoings. Because we know that at the end of the day, many of them did absolutely nothing to improve the lives of the Palestinian people. Now, the recent wave of unrest throughout the region is teaching all of us a very important lesson. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is only one of many active conflicts that are national, military, tribal. They have nothing to do with Israel. I don't have to tell you that. The masses that were marching against their own regimes in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Libya, now in Syria, their plight has nothing to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now that's a great opportunity for us because we can put things back into the right proportion. There's no reason why Israel shouldn't have diplomatic relations with countries that have no direct confrontation, military confrontation or hostility with Israel. You know, for years we've been talking about Lebanon. Lebanon without the influence of Hezbollah, is there a reason? We have no territorial claims over Lebanon, no claims that are related to water. We have no reason to be in conflict with the state of Lebanon, with Lebanon the country. Think about it. And I can go on and give you a whole list of countries in our region that theoretically speaking, in a new realigned Middle East, there's a great opportunity for Israel. The opportunity is also economic. We can do great business throughout the region. There is, for example, a fund that is being established in Israel these days that is dedicated to investments in Turkey. I'm giving you this as an example because despite of all the talk about the tension between Israel and Turkey, I want you to know the trade between the two countries went up 30% in the last 2 years. 30%. So I'm just using this as an example to the kind of opportunity that exists there. The whole notion of democracy. Look, we are big believers in this thing called the theory of democratic peace. We believe that democracies do not invade one another, and no democracy was ever defeated by tyranny. Therefore, by definition, despite of the fact that we were somewhat quiet when the so-called Arab Spring erupted, we sat quietly for about 3 weeks. We do support, obviously, every freedom movement in the Middle East and every pro-democracy force that exists throughout the hemisphere. But at the same time, we understand that democracy is way more than just the political process of elections. We remember what happened in Gaza. In Gaza, we indirectly enabled a terrorist organization, Hamas, to exploit the democratic process in order to take over Gaza. And today, Gaza, I don't have to tell you, is not being governed or managed democratically. So in the name of democracy, we allowed a terrorist organization to run the Gaza Strip. We have to understand the implications of this. Now, obviously, as I said before, we support democracy. We believe that a more democratic Middle East, by definition, is a safer Middle East for the State of Israel. But at the same time, we say our job is to be alert, to monitor the situation very closely, and to make sure that we're prepared for all eventualities. Lastly, I'd like to touch upon the issue, obviously, of Iran. You all know that Iran, the Iranian efforts to acquire nuclear capabilities, military capabilities, is an issue that tops our agenda. I just want to reiterate to this audience our position on this issue. We do believe that the world doesn't have the luxury of allowing Iran to become nuclear. And while we certainly had a big part in the fact that the entire international community is discussing the Iranian nuclear threat today, I would like to emphasize that Iran is certainly not just Israel's problem. This has to be put on the table. We believe that this is the wrong framing. I don't know if you guys remember, but about a year ago, the New York Times Sunday magazine ran a story, a cover story, that said Israel versus Iran. And I know that some Hollywood writers were already working on a script, on a screenplay that will depict the showdown between Israel and Iran. This is not about Israel versus Iran. It's the wrong way to look at it. This is about the West versus Iran. Iran poses a conceptual threat, not only a physical threat. And this conceptual threat has to be dealt with because we believe at the end of the day, they mean what they say and they say what they mean. And I'd like to end with a little story that I heard from my great friend, Rabbi Joe Potasnik, that illustrates that point. They tell the story about a meeting that supposedly took place some 90 years ago in Vienna between two Jewish great minds. One was Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, the founder of Reform Judaism here in North America, and the other was famous psychologist Sigmund Freud. And according to the story, Sigmund Freud turned to Rabbi Weiss and asked him, Rabbi, who would you say are the three greatest Jews alive? And the rabbi said, well, one would be you, Mr. Freud, obviously. The second, he said, would be Dr. Chaim Weizmann, the head of the Zionist movement at the time. And about a third, he said, I cannot think about a third. And Freud said, well, why won't you, Rabbi, be the third greatest Jew alive? And the rabbi said, no, absolutely not. Freud looked at him and said, Rabbi, one no would have been enough. So people not always say what they mean, and they do not always mean what they say. But in the case of Ahmadinejad and his peers in the Iranian leadership, I think we don't need Sigmund Freud. We know exactly. They create enough trouble as is without becoming nuclear. They instigate instability all over the world, from Latin America through North Africa and Central Asia, certainly in the Middle East. Allowing them access to nuclear devices may change our lives in a very fundamental way. Because I want you to think about not only about the fact, that the Israeli government has been talking about Iran entering the zone of immunity and all that. That's clear, that's obvious, makes sense. I want you to think about what will happen to us, to the way we live our lives, to the way we conduct business, to the way we travel, once terrorist organizations and terrorist groups will have access to nuclear devices. Just as today Iran is allowing them access to conventional weapons. So on that optimistic note, I'd like to end my presentation and take some of your questions. Thank you so much.